When archaeologists excavated Viking settlements in Greenland and northern Iceland, they kept finding something that should have been impossible. These ancient homes had stood through centuries of violent winds, shifting ice, and Arctic storms, and yet the structures were warm, stable, and astonishingly efficient. What confused researchers most were the strange construction features built into the walls: little channels, tiny gaps, unexpected layers, elements no one could explain at first. They seemed too intentional to be accidents, but too subtle to be random. Later, in the early 1900s, when Scandinavian engineers attempted to rebuild Arctic towns using similar methods, they tried to follow what the Vikings had done, but the results were baffling. Their modern versions didn't work nearly as well. The Viking homes stayed warmer, used hardly any fuel, and maintained a soft, quiet indoor climate that modern builders simply couldn't replicate. By the mid-1900s, the design was considered so effective that certain aspects of it were quietly filed into restricted civil defense archives. What was this subtle trick the Vikings understood, and why was it quietly discouraged from ever being taught again? The answer lies in the one thing the Vikings mastered that most builders still ignore: homes that breathed. The Arctic isn't just freezing, it's alive with movement. Winds shift, snow compacts, frost pushes the ground upward, and the air itself becomes an enemy if trapped in the wrong place. The Vikings realize something simple but, well, revolutionary. A stiff, sealed house dies in the Arctic, a breathing house survives. Their design wasn't about sound or comfort, it was about air. The trick worked through a principle modern engineers call passive thermal convection. Instead of sealing their turf walls solid, the Vikings built them in layered sections that encouraged a slow, gentle movement of air. Warm air from the central fire rose through the house, while cold, outside air seeped inward through tiny channels at the base of the turf walls. This created a continuous, invisible flow, never strong enough to feel as a draft, but always moving. That air cycle kept moisture under control, prevented mold, stabilized temperature, and maintained humidity at levels that protected food, tools, and wood. Later, European settlers who ignored these principles found their houses rotten within years. Viking homes lasted centuries. Archaeologists eventually confirmed the presence of thin internal vents, tiny gaps between turf layers, narrow cracks between stones, and even deliberate seams of dried seaweed placed between sections. Seaweed, packed with natural salts and air pockets, acted as both a moisture regulator and a microvent system. When modern researchers rebuilt these houses and measured the air movement, they were, well, stunned. Even with temperatures dropping to minus 25 degrees Celsius outside, a properly built Viking-style turf house could hold a steady 18 degrees inside with just a modest fire. And, unlike wooden cabins or modern insulated structures, the air stayed fresh without the need for fans, heaters, or electricity. The genius, you see, was in the balance, not the materials. In the late 1930s and 1940s, Scandinavian engineers took another look at these old methods while they were planning Arctic outposts and wartime bunkers. What they discovered was, well, a bit uncomfortable. Homes made with these Viking airflow techniques outperformed barracks that were heated with coal or oil. They stayed warmer with less fuel, required no moving parts, and almost never grew mold. In a period when fuel shortages were common, this attracted attention not just from scientists but from national energy offices and defense authorities. When reports showed that a turf-based airflow system could reduce fuel use by more than half, the technique was quietly classified. The official explanation was that it was unreliable or unfit for modern standards. But, the real fear was economic. A house that needed no furnace, no fuel, and no maintenance was viewed as a threat to industrial heating, energy markets, and post-war building industries. The truth was simple. The method worked. It only required patience, local materials, and a mindset closer to the Viking worldview than to industrial engineering. The process began with foundations built from carefully chosen stone. These stones acted as both drainage and thermal storage. Above the stones sat the turf walls. These weren't random chunks of sod, they were cut into tight blocks and stacked with alternating root directions, creating strong, flexible walls filled with countless air pockets. Between the turf layers, the Vikings placed thin sheets of straw, moss, or seaweed. These layers created microchannels that encouraged slow airflow and prevented moisture from becoming trapped. The structure wasn't sealed, it was alive. The roof completed this breathing system, built low with a gentle curve, supported by bent wood or whalebone, then covered in thick turf. The roof prevented drafts while acting as a massive thermal blanket. Wind slid over it instead of hitting it. Warm air rose, cooled slightly at the top, and drifted down the curved interior, keeping the heat moving in a stable cycle. The result was a home that stayed quiet in storms, warm through long nights and dry in even the harshest conditions. Families could bank a fire down to glowing coals and the interior temperature barely changed. Later settlers burned through 3 times as much firewood for worse results. For anyone today seeking off-grid living or Arctic shelter design, the Viking system still works. Start by using the earth itself as your first layer of insulation. Even a partially dug structure reduces heat loss dramatically. Focus on layered natural insulation, soil, straw, sand, and sod, alternate to trap air and resist moisture. Build dense, heavy roofs that hold warmth. And finally, control airflow with narrow natural vents that encourage circulation without letting heat escape too quickly. The right balance turns the entire house into a passive, self-regulating thermal engine. What makes this method extraordinary is that it wasn't written down. It was learned by watching wind, earth, animals, and fire. After being dismissed for centuries, tested again, and quietly buried for political reasons, the truth remained. The Vikings created some of the best cold-climate homes the world has ever seen. Their design succeeded not by fighting nature, but by understanding it intimately, and that is the real secret behind why it worked so well, and why it disappeared. In an age facing energy shortages and unstable climates, perhaps their forgotten wisdom is more valuable than ever.